working with other leadership of DEQ and DHHS on the agenda, and Paula and others for the logistics of getting us the conference room, the refreshments, the parking passes. Looks like Paula has ducked out, but thanks for Paula.
Get up, Paula.
Right there.
Oh, fine. Thank you. And thanks also to our IT support. We appreciate it. We do have a couple of folks who plan to join remotely. We won't have David Howard in person, but we may have him in the afternoon. And we may have Elena in the morning, but not in the afternoon. And I heard from Viney Aneja that he will not be attending today. But otherwise, we are well over a quorum, and I appreciate everybody's attendance. I hear that the Archdale ground floor conference room that we've used has been updated with audio-visual equipment that will make a meeting like this hybrid meeting that we're having today more possible, so that's an option to check it out. But be sure and provide feedback on how this location works. There was a little bit more road noise last time we met here, but it also seemed like a nice size and setting for the typical level of public participation that we get. So we have options. Let us know your preference. With that, I'm going to move us to item 2 on the agenda, to review and approve the agenda. One small change that I'll note is that sometime around 11:30, which may be the break between the action item on bioaccumulation factors and the information items, but anyway, around 11:30, I need to step away, and Dr. Betsy Tilson with DHHS is going to chair the meeting from that point on. That's the only change I'm aware of. Are there any comments or questions about the agenda as drafted? Then it would be appropriate to entertain a motion to adopt it as drafted.
So moved. Second.
I heard a motion and a second. All in favor? Aye. Anyone opposed? Great. Before we move to the ethics statement, I'm going to ask if we have anybody who signed up for the public speaking portion of it so far. Paula says no. We'll check again at the later. We'll check again at the end to see if anybody who has come in wants to do that. But John has reminded me that that's a good practice to ask early in case there's somebody who wanted to speak about a particular topic. We could entertain talking to them, talking with them, hearing from them before we take action on that. So now we know. So the ethics statement is on the board, and I'll read it. In accordance with the State Government Ethics Act, it's the duty of every board member to avoid both conflicts of interest and the appearances of conflict. If any board member has any known conflict of interest or is aware of facts that might create the appearance of such conflict with respect to any matters coming before the board today, please identify the conflict or the facts that might create the appearance of a conflict to ensure that any inappropriate participation in that matter may be avoided. If at any time any new matter raises a conflict during the meeting, please be sure to identify it at that time. So with that, are there any board members who wish to declare a conflict or the appearances of such for consideration? Jamie?
I'd just like to note that I receive state and federal funding for the study of PFAS and do and have served as a plaintiff's expert witness in cases involving PFAS.
Okay. And Detlef?
I also receive state and federal funding for PFAS research.
The only action item today is related to PFAS. It's commentary on the bioaccumulation factors for fish. It's advisory, so appearances of conflict are noted. And
So one other, I don't know that it follows under the Government Ethics Act, but I'll be serving on the IARC monograph team that will be looking at the carcinogenicity of PFO and PFOS.
great. That'll be good expertise and feedback to have, as is Jamie's and Detlef's. All right. I think we're already at agenda item 4, approval of the meeting minutes from February 7th. And those were circulated to the board along with the draft agenda. I have not received any suggested edits. I don't know, have you, Franny, received any suggested edits? So those are available now for any questions or comments on the draft. Folks are okay with them as drafted. A motion to adopt them as drafted would be appropriate.
So moved.
David, thank you.
Second.
Second. All in favor? Aye. Any opposed? Great. We don't need anything except for draft taken off of those for them to be posted on the SAB website with the helpful links to previous presentations. That's been working well. That'll bring us to agency updates. For DEQ, we're joined by Sushma Mace-Moore, the Assistant Secretary for the Environment.
Good morning. Well, I could.
Sounds like Franny wants you to.
I have this one too. Good morning. Thank you for being here. I'm Sushma Mace-Moore, Assistant Secretary for Environment. I wanted to give an update mainly on PFAS, as that is something that's in front of the board for some time now. We at the department continue to implement our action strategy for PFAS. This sets priorities in 3 key activity areas. One is protecting our communities, second is protecting our drinking water sources, and third is cleaning up existing contamination. I'll spend most of the time talking about this first area. We completed sampling of 50 large municipal drinking water systems in anticipation of EPA's drinking water standards for PFOA and PFAS. This happened in the fall of last year. We have processed that data, QA'd them, and have posted that, as well as communicated the results of that to the operating systems. We now know that EPA has proposed MCLs for these systems, and we are working with these affected communities and operators to communicate our findings and what the EPA regulatory requirements will entail. Our DWR team is also implementing a larger sampling campaign to characterize PFAS in smaller public water systems. These are community systems that are not at the municipal level. We have prepared a plan, or in the process of implementing that plan for sampling. In a few minutes, you'll hear from Richard's team talking about these activities, drinking water systems, where they are and what the data looks like. Our groundwater team in our DWR division also continues to complete the testing of all ambient monitoring wells throughout the state. You heard a little bit about this in the past meetings. Our goal is to complete all of the ambient monitoring wells that are in our purview that we either oversee or have access to. Once this data is available and we have reviewed them and quality assured them, we will come back here and give you all a review and a briefing. But the data will also be available to the public for consumption. I'll transition a little bit to the Comores site, since that is where a lot of our PFAS-related activities are occurring. Residential well sampling surrounding the site in the near counties continues. To date, 10,000 residences' wells have been sampled. Over 5,000 qualify for a reverse osmosis treatment system, and another 1,900 qualify for full house GAC system, granular activated carbon systems or also they could qualify for municipal water systems. Our team at DWM, as well as our Secretary's office teams, are having conversations ongoing with Bladen County and Cumberland counties to determine the feasibility of connecting these homes to municipal water supplies. I'll transition to a little bit to the lower Cape Fear counties. Remember, we talked about the contamination from Comores site back in November of 2022. We asked Comores to further characterize the contamination in these 4 lower Cape Fear counties, and that's New Hanover, Brunswick, Columbus, and Pender counties. As you heard in the past, sampling has started based on requests by residences and based on priorities that we have established with Comores to test those wells. I have some data to show you where we are on that effort. There are now 1,083 residences in the lower Cape Fear counties that have PFAS in their residential wells. These are above the consent order criteria. 636 are in New Hanover County, 93 are in Brunswick County, 352 are in Pender County, and 2 are in Columbus County. A total of 4,462 samples have been collected, and the 1,083 that I mentioned are about 24% positive rates that are coming back. We have identified with Chemours a total of 7,100 or so properties that will get tested. We believe there are significant other properties that are eligible for testing. We just have not received requests from the residences. So we're working very diligently, and we're working on developing a further campaign to communicate with those residences to reach out and request testing. So anything this team can do to help do that outreach would be very beneficial to those homeowners. We're also reviewing the Chemours work plan for assessing PFAS in the Lower Cape Fear region. This work plan basically tests a variety of hypotheses as to how the contamination ended up in these areas, in these homes. We have reviewed the work plan. We're in the second round, and we're having further internal dialogue. So in the coming months, you'll be hearing the results of that evaluation process as that work plan gets executed. On a more of a construction scale, we talked a little bit about treatment system that has been in works to extract groundwater and treat that groundwater in front of a underground barrier wall. That project is under construction now. The barrier wall is coming well together. We've had an opportunity to visit through various teams. This will be again in Bladen County. This is about a mile long, about 70 feet deep, 2.5 to 3 feet wide wall that will be underground that will stop the flow of certain amount of groundwater flow into the Cape Fear River. That extraction system and the treatment system that has been required to comply with the NPDES permit requirements, the limits that we established are considered the strongest in the country for any PFAS discharges. At this point, that treatment system and the groundwater extraction system is operating. The last we heard was at about 20% of the design flow. And we will continue to monitor on the progress of that. Related to Chemours site, you know that the emissions from the site are controlled by a thermal oxidizer as well as various carbon absorbers. Our DAQ team has been working with EPA ORD and the Chemours testing personnel. They have evaluated the use of the OTM, the other test method 50, at the site on the thermal oxidizer in the last campaign, the SAC test that they did about a month ago. The data will be available and reviewed in the coming weeks, in a few months. We're also working to determine the feasibility of a similar test at other locations at the site, and those discussions are ongoing. And then finally, related to our third item, which is knowing where the contaminations are and discussing the findings to the public and putting in play action items, I wanted to just highlight, in addition to what we're doing with Chemours, our DWM team has worked with the Guilford County Health Department and the City of Greensboro to sample private wells for PFAS around the Greensboro Airport. This is an area that we were aware of, and we went back and resampled about 22 wells. Those data have come back, and our team through Michael Scott have been working with the local health department and the city officials as well as the property owners to communicate those data that were above the MCLs for PFOA and PFAS. And then finally, on March 13th, our DWM team notified solid waste landfills to begin sampling for PFAS in groundwater, surface water, and leachate samples after July 1 of this year. So that's a little bit of what's going on, and I'm happy to answer questions. You hear a lot from Franny and our DWR team on other items related to EPA's recent announcement. So I'll pause to see if there are any questions.
Yes, thanks so much. Are there questions for Assistant Secretary Mace-Moore? Cliff, and then John.
Yeah, a couple. One relates to the 50 drinking water systems sources that you're testing. I think there's a few missing that are important. And I can talk with you a little bit about it. It's maybe a handful, but they happen to be relatively low, I think, when the testing network sampled them, but we know they would be well above the 4 grams per liter for PFOA and PFOS. I can share that. The other is, I recently got an email from a person living near, just north of Holden Beach, and their well was quite contaminated. It looked, with all the Chemours compounds. And I'm just curious what the theories are. How did, it looks more like the wastewater signature, not the air deposition signature. So is it, you think it's public water supply lines leaking there, or is it related to the wastewater plant, or?
The theories that are being tested, and maybe what we could do in the next meeting, we could put out some maps of what we're seeing in terms of the contamination levels as well as the different species or chemicals that we're seeing. The primary theory is that the leaking water and sewer lines that transported water and wastewater after collecting from the Cape Fear River, and then as that was being distributed throughout the counties, has also distributed the contamination over the years. Particularly, we're seeing hits around those around those pipeline infrastructure. The other theory is, of course, the groundwater for contamination and transport of that water to different private wells. Stormwater runoffs, as well as floodplain impacts around those private residences is also one of the theories. And so what we have, if you look at the work plan, and we can summarize that in the next meeting, the various theories as to how the contamination may have reached these areas are being tested through additional sampling. So there's Michael, maybe if you could tell me how many wells are additionally planned to be sampled to test those theories?
There's a series of wells regarding source areas, so biosolids. There was extra wells that have been added or proposed around biosolid application areas as a potential source. The exact number of wells on the municipal water sewer line, I'm not recalling right offhand, but as Sushma mentioned, that additional work plan review that we're doing, additional sampling points were added by DEQ to that work plan. And so we can present that in the next overview regarding what those additional well numbers look like. But the hypotheses relate to river impacts, water and sewer line impacts, as Sushma already noted, and then obviously other sources of contamination where we know groundwater was already impacted by PFAS.
I think Brunswick County was also land applying wastewater at one of their sites. Is that being looked at?
That's part of the coverage that we're looking at, and various counties nearby had land application from the various sites in those 4 counties. So we're looking at that as part of our hypothesis.
In one case, it's more like biosolids. In the other, it's the actual wastewater, I think, that they sprayed on.
Yeah, we can share that with you and get some feedback. And again, we have to prioritize what gets first. As you notice, the number of wells, we're looking at about 25%. So our initial theory that to target certain areas is in some ways proven correct. But now the question is how widespread is it? Because it's contingent on how many people contacted and got tested. And there's many more residences that are nearby that are not yet tested.
And just, for everybody, that the well was fairly highly contaminated, had over 500 nanoparticles including PFMOAA, PFO2HXA, PFO3OA, PFO4OA, including even some of the more bioaccumulative others. So, and I would have not expected those kind of levels near Holden Beach in a private well. Yeah.
And one other item that Rudy mentioned is the ASR wells, the aquifer storage recovery wells are also targeted as potential sources of initial contamination.
John?
I may have missed something in a previous discussion about the Greensboro Airport. Could you fill in just a little bit as to why the sampling is there and if there's consideration for other airports like Raleigh-Durham or Charlotte?
If it's okay, Michael, if you could give a history of 2019, I think that's when it started.
Yeah, good question. So we worked collaboratively with the city of Greensboro and the Guilford County Health Department. DHHS has been a valued partner here also. The city identified PFAS in their drinking water reservoir. So if you go to the city's website, they're very proactive about what the emerging compound data is, what they're sampling for, what it reflects, and they've looked at sources. So part of their source identification work centered around the Greensboro Airport. The hypothesis is that it's the firefighting foam, AFFF, that has been deployed potentially over a series of years at the airport, has run off from that area through key surface water features like Horsepin Creek onto the reservoir that the city draws from for drinking water. So in 2018, in speaking with the city, then the health department, we felt there was a need to perform some private well sampling around that area. We did not find elevated levels above the combined 70 for PFOA and PFOS at the time. We went back in 2019, did a limited subset resample, still did not have exceedances of those levels. But as we anticipated, the EPA draft MCLs, we felt that follow-up sampling was also needed in 2022. So we held a community meeting, which the health department hosted, offered sampling for homes around those tributaries that feed the reservoir. And then we've just now gotten that analytical data back in. We're looking at the draft MCLs as a reference point and obviously communicating with the homeowners through the health department and with their analytical data, on what that data shows, what some next steps are. So based on the city's conclusions, a lot focuses on the airport and potential AFFF use.
Now, do you expect that could be the case also at other airports like Raleigh-Durham or Charlotte?
Yeah, so that work is underway. There's a lot of Department of Defense work, Navy, Marine Corps work that's underway right now, meaning the assessment phase. We're not moving into remedies, but we're seeing drinking water supplies that are sampled at Department of Defense installations, areas where they know foam was used or sampled, meaning the airports. And yes, the short answer is other airports have also been sampled. So it's an active discussion. I think everyone's aware of the importance of AFFF to protect life and property, but historical formulations also bring the PFAS discussion front and center.
Thank you. That's very helpful.
Any other questions, comments from the board? Thank you, we appreciate it. I understand that the DHHS update will be provided by Kennedy Holt. And while Kennedy comes forward, we'll just remind you that he's the chemical risk assessor for DHHS and gave a well-received presentation yesterday at the North Carolina Water, Public Health, and Healthcare Coordination Workshop. So good job yesterday, and thanks for addressing us today.
Thank you. So with DHHS, we have, I guess, a couple updates. One is on the fish tissue data that DEQ has presented on in the past. We are finalizing our work on the determination for fish consumption advisories based upon that data, and we're working on a suite of things. One, the fish consumption advisories themselves, but we're also working on the communication and outreach and the communication plan because it is an impact, both as to impact Bladen, Columbus, Pender, Brunswick, and New Hanover counties. Eventually, I know we've only done the freshwater parts and the brackish parts haven't got there yet, but eventually it will stretch into those. So we're working on a communication plan so that all the counties will be on the same page. And then also communication materials such as signage templates and messages for local health departments and other local jurisdictions so that the message is coordinated and that everybody's on the same page as we go through that. And we're hoping to have that work completed before the start of summer, so that we'll have all that out to our partners and ready for the public as well. The second thing, just want to bring attention to the board in terms of new work that we're doing is this year we are working with the DEQ's division, Water Sciences Division, to increase our monitoring of algal toxins in North Carolina. So we'll be taking samples that DEQ regularly collects during algal bloom outbreaks and their routine monitoring, and splitting them and doing additional analysis for a suite of cyanotoxins, so cylindrosporopsin, microcystins, antitoxin, and saxitoxin as well, to get data on those toxins and their prevalence in North Carolina, because we don't have a lot of work on that. So this will help establish a background for these toxins in North Carolina and indicate if we need to do future follow-up work on those as well. And those are the updates we have for y'all today.
Are there questions or comments for Kennedy from board members?
I had a quick question. With algal toxins, when you're doing the sampling, are you intending on only sampling bloom or areas that aren't visually affected by blooms as well? Because that's always an open question of how widespread the contamination might be outside of the bloom itself.
Yeah, so we're trying to do both. We're trying to do both the, so typically, historically in North Carolina, our algal bloom response is, as you kind of alluded to, indicated at the visual representation of where the bloom is, or sometimes just because of how transient algal blooms are, sometimes we don't get out there in time to get there when it's still green. And so we sample where we got the report from. But with this work, we do want to establish kind of that potential background for areas that maybe don't have algal blooms, because the toxins don't necessarily break down in the same time frame that the algal bloom is there, so toxins can linger over time. So we want to get both background and sample in areas that are not visibly impacted by blooms as well, to help get some of that background data, for a better way of putting it.
Jamie?
This is sort of an odd question, but I understand that commercial fishers have a lot of folklore and knowledge about various aquatic toxins. Is there any plan to reach out to commercial fishers to see if they have ideas where hotspots might be for sampling?
Not at this time. I'll say this is pilot's not the right word, but this is kind of the first time we're doing this work. And so right now, DEQ, we're kind of piggybacking off DEQ's work, because right now they do have routine monitoring plans for North Carolina water bodies where they go out and just take routine samples to check for typical water quality parameters. So we want to run those samples for some of the background, but also in terms to algal bloom response, they have their field staff kind of ready to go in those cases. So we're in this initial, I guess, phase of this, we're kind of just using those samples in those areas to go collect the initial samples in locations. That being said, we do have pretty well established communities, especially in the Albemarle region, because there's a pretty endemic issue with algal blooms in the Albemarle Sound and Chowan River area. So we do have pretty well established connections with the Albemarle Health District and communities up there. There are citizen science groups that do some of this work as well. And so that would be, again, because of the need in that area and also the interest, the community is pretty invested in how these algal blooms are impacted their communities. That would be a group we would definitely reach out to in the future.
Detlef and then Dave.
I was curious, are you coordinating the sampling with also drinking water providers and specifically looking at drinking water intakes?
Not at this time. Typically, historically, our algal bloom response has been mainly targeted at recreational algal bloom exposure, so swimming, fishing, things of that nature, not necessarily drinking water. We have gotten inquiries just because of community interest in them reaching out to their utilities. We have gotten inquiries from utilities about various algal toxins. I know some utilities do some sporadic microcystin analysis. I'm not sure about the whole kind of the suite I mentioned of algal toxins, but that is not what we're doing at this time. Again, this is kind of just the first time we're able to do this work. And so my hope and thought is that if we, depending on what the data show, it could help provide a narrative for expanding this work and maybe looking elsewhere for some of these things. But again, this is kind of just the first time we're able to doing this.
It's been something on my mind since I moved to North Carolina back in the 90s. Algotoxins or cyanotoxins were a very hot topic, and then it's kind of disappeared until Toledo came. I think we lack good information about algotoxins at drinking water intakes.
And it's definitely something where, and this was actually kind of the impetus why we pushed for trying to get some of this work done, is because historically we've only had the capabilities of sampling from microcystin. Originally that had been housed within DHHS, but the funding for that kind of dried up. But then DEQ got their lab equipped and they got up to speed and were able to continue that work, so there wasn't a break in our microcystin analysis. But this is basically an additional suite, these additional cylinder swamps and antitoxin, saxitoxin is the first time we're to be able to do a statewide sampling for these.
Very good.
David?
So it might also be worth to reach out to NOAA to see if any of their sensor technologies could be actually adapted for freshwater use. I don't know if you're aware, but NOAA has offshore monitoring for things like red tide off of Florida, and they actually do look for both the presence of the algae and the toxins. So because they don't really deal with fresh water, but some of those systems might actually be amenable to be put where you could, say, monitor a lake for hotspots over time, longitudinally.
Yeah, it definitely, I am aware of NOAA's predictive capabilities when they come and looking at the sensory data for they've used chlorophyll as kind of for determining algal bloom outbreaks, and I've seen some of that on North Carolina coast, and I think it still works in the sound from some of the models I've seen, like in the sound areas, because they're brackish waters. It would be something I could follow up with NOAA about the freshwater implementation, because I'm not as sure on that.
Just worth reaching out to them to say what sensors might be available.
Yeah, probably no end to the leads you can chase down as you start a new venture like that. I was going to say the same thing, and I guess will. There's a researcher at Auburn, Alan Wilson, who's been asking collaborators of natural areas around the country to provide, throughout the southeast, to provide samples from lakes. So he's supposed to be creating an inventory of algal toxins in lakes through time. I know that he's got samples from North Carolina because I helped provide those. So Alan Wilson at Auburn may be somebody who's got some exposure information available.
All right, yeah.
For coastal North Carolina lakes.
All right, great.
All
Thank
fresh water. Yeah, any other questions or comments for Kennedy? All right, thank you.
Thank y'all.
I'll remind people before we get into action item number 1 that Franny's going to help tee up for us, which is our only action item, that this is an abbreviated meeting because we've worked through other items on the agenda. We, at the last meeting, did the final round of edits on the PFMOA document. Maybe out of the presentations this afternoon, we'll hear of additional work items, but this bioaccumulation factors, for which we're near the end, I think, of our advisory role, having addressed 2 of the 3 charge statements already. This is the only action item. So I'm going to remind folks that the board has, a role. We're all busy, but the board has a role not just in reviewing actions and consulting with the agencies, but also under our charter, a proactive role to bring items to the agency's attention. We have roles to make suggestions for areas of inquiry or priority chemicals of interest, either exposure-wise or effects-wise. And I'll just remind people that while the agendas are light, if you have an idea of something that you wish we would be getting into, that you think that the agencies need to be aware of, bring it forward, bring it to me or Franny. Randy will be able to work with the agency's leadership to help put that suggestion in the context of things that they're already busy working on and potentially move it forward. So a light agenda today. The agenda for our meeting 2 months from now will be in part based on actions that the agencies ask us to look at, but there's also the availability of space on the agenda for things to be brought forward. So with that little bit of housekeeping, I'll turn it over to Franny to tee up. We're going to walk back a little bit and remind people how we got here, what the 3 charge statements are, what the remaining work is, and then suggest a path forward for closure on this item.
Good morning, everybody. I'm going to give you a brief synopsis of the work that we've done over the last several months, both with you in the meetings and then to answer some additional questions, and then we'll go through the very last charge question. I'll start over. The bioaccumulation factors the bioaccumulation factors for PFAS and PFOA were something we were evaluating in the EPA's aquatic life criteria draft document for use in surface water standards development here in North Carolina. And so a little bit of background for that is that these bioaccumulation factors will be used for a surface water standard, and this is a regulation or a rule that is used to protect a variety of different surface water bodies, including those that are specified for uses as public drinking water supplies, and then also the human consumption of fish tissue. And so the bioaccumulation factors are not going to be used by DEQ for a consumption advisory, as that's something that DHHS does. This is used to walk backwards to figure out a protective surface water concentration that allows the fish to be consumed. These standards are established from the EPA's Clean Water Act criteria, other published EPA regulatory values, and then our own statute, which is the NC 02B 0208 rule. Bioaccumulation factors are really just an estimate of what is in the fish tissue and what is in the water, and then you get a factor related to exposure from consumption. These are determined by just comparing the concentration that is found in the fish tissue to the concentration that is in the water column, and then you just divide them by each other, and it's a very simple factor calculation. The bioaccumulation factors are used to develop standards, really just to derive that surface water concentration that will allow us to prevent a harmful chemical from accumulating in fish so it can be consumed safely by people. The fish tissue standard is this calculation here, and so you can see it uses the bioaccumulation factor, but it also uses a reference dose, which is important for PFAS and PFOA, as the draft MCLs and the draft documents around all of that have recently changed. The concentration and the values have changed. Surface water supply standard is similar. The BAF is one piece of this bigger equation, as well as the reference dose. The sources for the bioaccumulation information in this presentation and that we've been talking about are the draft aquatic life ambient water quality criteria that was put forth by the EPA last year. We started out with a North Carolina specific evaluation of these bioaccumulation factors, and so what we did was we filtered all of the information that the EPA put out based on species that were resident to North Carolina. These are also commonly consumed species, and we used their muscle tissue bioaccumulation factors. So there were liver bioaccumulation factors and whole body factors, but we used muscle because that's the piece of the fish that is most commonly consumed. For the shellfish BAFs, we used the whole body. When we presented this information in December, the board requested that we include all species from the EPA's Direct Aquatic Life criteria in our calculations and use those for comparison. So that is the table I'm about to show you. This table is large and has a lot of information, so I'll orient you. The top section is all the PFAS information, so that is in the blue color. And then the bottom is PFOA, and so it's separated first by group, and it's North Carolina specific fish mussel BAFs, and then the North Carolina specific fish and shellfish BAFs together. And then the numbers in bold are all of the fish species from the EPA Draft Aquatic Life Criteria, and then all of the fish and shellfish together. And so similarly for PFOA, which is the light green. We looked at these at the last meeting, and really what we were interested in, and the question that we were asking was, how different will the BAFs be if we include all species rather than just the North Carolina specific species? And so the numbers are a little different, especially the maximum and the minimum, but the central tendencies, the geometric mean, the average, and the median are all relatively similar. The geometric mean is also fairly close to what I've calculated for the Cape Fear River fish, and I presented that at the last meeting. As far as our request to the board went, we asked these 3 questions. And so the first question was that if the board supports the use of the EPA literature for the foundation of our bioaccumulation factor needs for North Carolina. And the board's answer was yes in December of 2022. The second question is if the method that we applied to the EPA's vetted data is scientifically sound, is this approach acceptable for use in North Carolina with these bioaccumulation factors? And so the second question was where we went back and added all of the species from the Draft Aquatic Life Criteria documents. And in seeing these numbers and the difference or the lack thereof, the board said that yes, this is a scientifically sound approach for us to use in North Carolina, and that was at the last meeting. The final question, which was a topic of discussion at the last meeting, we're interested in which value is most appropriate. So all of the central tendencies that can be used can be argued one way or another, which is most appropriate and which value should be used in our calculations. We had a long discussion about this, and the board requested that we just revise this particular question. And so to make it follow the other questions better and to be more in tune with the EPA's information that we're using, it was requested that it be revised to say, is the EPA's method of using the geometric mean as the bioaccumulation factor scientifically sound for use in North Carolina water bodies with PFOA and PFAS? I've listened to the meeting a few times, and this was the question that it sounded like we all preferred. And so if this needs to be edited further, just let me know. But that is how I've reworded the third charge question. And so if this is the proper question or not, let me know.
Yeah, thanks so much for teeing it up again. So real salient points out of there is that, you know, the goal here isn't a fish consumption advisory. It's a concentration in surface water that will protect fish from accumulating a level that would be harmful to eat. So the goal is a surface water concentration. And other salient point is that there's a lot of material in notes and presentations behind the yeses. And so when we get to closure today, we should find out what DEQ, how they want that, if the yes is enough, or whether there needs to be a summary document for that. We have Chris Ventalora, the State Water Quality Standards Coordinator, so be thinking about what the right rock is. If the answers are sufficient, great, we're done. But if you need to have the granularity behind them someplace other than the recordings, we could draft something up if that's what's needed. Work with Franny on that. And I say that because, you know, the yes is a yes, but it was a yes based on, which might be important for the EMC or somebody else to hear later, the fact that EPA synthesis was current. These were from 22 to 2022 documents, and their literature search was updated up through like year 2020. So new information. EPA used 5 data quality sieves to put the data into high, medium, and low quality bins. The state adopted those, you know, in asking this question about is the EPA data the one to use, or is that sufficient? I think that that's kind of baked in, and we said that back. that it was a current comprehensive literature review, and the data had been through a data quality sieve. So granularity like that, I think, is important at some point for either people to know that that's the foundation for the yes. And then on the last one, the approach that DEQ applied was a yes because of the people said in the first meeting that it was sound to use a truncated data set just for those taxa that might occur in North Carolina or have surrogates in North Carolina, but that intellectually it seemed like it would be, worth looking at the whole data set to see if you might be surprised. And then when you look at all the data that Franny showed, it's kind of a toss-up when you're looking at central tendency. Therefore, the approach that the state's using, if that's simpler than explaining it to the public, would be sound. So I'm just pointing out that granularity behind the yeses, if that's important to capture somewhere, we will. But it does bring us to the last one, which is the rephrased one here of what summary statistic to use. We've been around that a couple of times. And if you think about the end goal of trying to protect a surface water concentration that is going to be based on a reference dose and this bioaccumulation factor, how would you summarize the bioaccumulation factor? We thought that the rephrasing would be important instead of saying, how could you do it? Or how would you do it? Is EPA's approach sound? And if the state adopts that, would they be on sound scientific ground? For which the answer seemed to be yes. There's other ways you could do it, but that's a fine way to do it. So I think that's where we are, is at number 3. And I think we have 2 things to do, which is come up with an answer for number 3, then find out whether we're done or what vehicle to synthesize these couple of months of discussions will wrap it up. And with that, I'll open it up to anybody on the floor for feedback on the rephrased charge question number 3.
Maybe before we get there, can I just get a quick clarification on 2 things? One, all of these fish were collected in Fayetteville and Wilmington.
This is
in the Cape Fear River.
All of these fish are from EPA's data set for the PFOA and PFOS criteria documents. These are a result of a literature synthesis of, ended up being 33,000 data points that were data sieved down to 5,000 data points.
Okay.
We said, it's a great question. We said the first time that we tackled this, that the state will have site-specific information that they can put in, that would be for one basin, and this is intended to be a statewide number.
Maybe I'm misremembering, but didn't we also look at North Carolina data last time?
We did, yeah. And what's important here is that while there is PFOS data for all of the North Carolina fish we collected last summer, there was only one individual fish out of the nearly 300 that had detectable levels of PFOA. And so we won't be able to derive a PFOA bioaccumulation factor for the Cape Fear River fish, which is particularly why the EPA is important.
And then also, as my understanding, it'll be one statewide number for surface water concentrations that are protective of fish. So the site-specific data for the Cape Fear is relevant, certainly. When Franny's saying the geometric means were similar, that's interesting. Maybe good granularity. But I think one's a number from mountain streams to coastal waters. We do have those 2 things going on at once, and they have been talked about at each of the meetings. These charge questions from DEQ, and then also DEQ presentations on last year's sampling of fish, for which the results are relevant.
That was what really stuck in my head, and maybe what I also hopefully remember right was the geometric means between the North Carolina data set for PFOS and the EPA data set were pretty similar.
They were.
Could you go back to that slide?
Yeah, they were both, the Cape Fear River fish, it was, I think, 1525 was the geometric mean for the largemouth bass and PFOA.
So just to make sure we're talking about the same thing, because given the passage of time, when you see this that says North Carolina fish mussel, that doesn't mean North Carolina sampling. That means it's the subset of EPA's data that were species that may occur in North Carolina and excluding things that wouldn't be expected to be here, which may make it easier for DEQ to roll this out to the public and say, we've based our statewide recommendation on data for species that are either occur here or would be similar to those that occur here. So everything on that slide is either the full EPA data set where it says all, or a subset of the EPA data set with no North Carolina specific values folded in yet. And what Franny was saying was last year's sampling from DEQ could be another line on there, but the geometric mean would be similar. Is that correct?
That's, yeah, so that was the last part of the question.
I know at the last meeting, if you asked a couple questions about the North Carolina BAFs and how they were derived, and I'm meaning to touch base with you about that. But it's in progress.
You can still do it, but I did look up PFOS concentrations in the river between Fayetteville and Wilmington, and the mean over from 2017 till now for PFOS is almost identical in Fayetteville and Wilmington. It's between 11 and 12 nanograms per liter for an average value. So that was one thing that we were thinking about a little bit last time was like a grab sample of the water is maybe not as representative of what the fish sees swimming in that water every day. So we can talk about the North Carolina data separately. Sorry for sidetracking.
No, that's okay. It's not a sidetrack. You had a couple. Was that all of them?
That's it.
Okay. Any other comments? Let's see, Jamie first and then Tom, and then I'd better look on this side.
So I think, with respect to the third charge question, is the geometric mean appropriate? I think I would agree that it is. It's in EPA federal level guidance documents. It's also used across several different states in their guidance documents for these criteria. But I just think it's really important that as these numbers get rolled out to the public, it's very carefully, the geometric mean is very carefully explained and described. I teach statistics and I sometimes get confused about the geometric mean. It's not something that I think is regularly taught in high schools, and if it is, it's probably associated with actuary tables. So just make sure there's a really good understandable definition of the geometric mean.
That's a really good point, because it's something that we know and understand, but it's only through necessity, right? So, yeah, good point.
So I'd be interested in hearing what the rationale EPA has made for using a geomean as opposed to a numerical average, arithmetic average. If you look there, you can see that there is a good bit of distortion in the distribution. It's numerical average is about two to three times higher, even higher than that for fish and shellfish in North Carolina. And I've always heard, that when you're doing risk calculations where over population the risks are distributed, you do an integration. If you do that integration, the arithmetic average is the right number to be using because that's what you would come out with, the average risk, not the geo risk, geomean risk. So I don't understand, or I don't know what the rationale for the geomean is to be preferred over the average. Certainly, the arithmetic average would provide a higher BAF and imply higher risk for the same concentration in the water. So can you enlighten me on that?
I can try.
Or maybe somebody else can.
So at least the way that I understand the difference between the geometric mean and the arithmetic mean in terms of just the numbers is that when you have a very large set of numbers, and Dr. DeWitt might be able to explain this probably more succinctly than I can, but the geometric mean tells you more about those specific numbers, as there might be a very wide variance between a lot of them, whereas the average or the arithmetic mean just puts them all together. And so I've used the geometric mean in different environmental statistics before because it told me a lot more about the specific concentrations of the populations I was dealing with. But as far as why the EPA chooses it, I can't say specifically. I don't know.
Just a couple of things from that paper by Larry Burkhart. It's a published paper in Environmental Toxicology and Chemistry, which is the presentation of the exact same data set, just not in the criteria document format. That might be important was they didn't include any non-detects. If there was a non-detect for surface water or a non-detect for fish tissue and they couldn't calculate a DAF, they excluded that from the data set. So it may already be skewed high because in cases where either were very low, they didn't make their way into the data set.
So non-detects are not included in this analysis.
And what percentage is non-detect?
Oh, I don't know the answer to that. I don't know that that's in the
Probably pretty
paper.
substantial.
It can make a big difference.
Oh, sure, it could, yeah. But again, if you're working on central tendency, maybe not as much. So I don't know that that was the reason why.
I don't know.
And then two things in that paper by Larry Burkhart, and I think you have to think about fit for purpose. EPA wasn't using the data for the same purpose as this. EPA was using it to say, if you have a concentration that's protective of fish themselves in water, this is where these criteria documents are, but I want to measure PFAS in a fish and determine whether that's going to be okay for the fish. I need a bioaccumulation factor. And the number that they picked was they used the geomean anytime that they had a batch of data. Like say they had 10 samples for bluegills, geomean to represent bluegill in their distribution. But from their distribution, they picked a 20th percentile value to try to push it toward being protective, or 80th percentile, depending on how it's ranked. But it's like an upper.
You mean the high end rather than the low end?
Yeah.
Okay, so that's what the arithmetic average would give you.
Arithmetic would push it that direction. I think if you had a whole, well, perhaps if the lower end was bounded as well.
So every numerical increment on the scale of the BAF scale, treated equally. The geomean, you're putting way more emphasis on the low end of the distribution.
Chris has a point.
Can you all hear me okay?
I don't think it's on.
How about now?
Again?
How about now?
No.
Just have to say it loud.
Speak loud.
Speak up, yeah.
Speak up. I'll try to speak up. Yeah. Anyway, so this may help provide, well, good morning, Chris Ventilaro, DWR Water Quality Standards Coordinator. This might help provide a little bit of context, at least from a water quality standards perspective, is that usually when EPA is developing criteria for water quality standards, they're looking at this from a national perspective. So they're tending to look more towards those central tendencies because these numbers that they're publishing, these criteria values, are going to have a very wide application across the country and apply to very, very different, potentially very different scenarios. So whereas with a specific risk assessment of like a specific site, you might want to narrow in on specific key features. With this, it tends to be more of a broad look at things. And it's kind of similar in the sense for us establishing standards for North Carolina is that we're looking to apply numbers statewide across a variety of different scenarios, if you will, exposure scenarios. So that, I don't know if that maybe helps provide any context for why a geomean might be looked at more than an arithmetic mean, but that's also one of the questions that you wanted to bring to the council to really get that input.
Well, one of the arguments could be that if you have a lot of extremely high values in the sample, outliers perhaps, the geomean would be less dependent upon those in terms of its value. That's why it's lower. But you can always do an outliers test and cut those from the calculation and still have an arithmetic average that would be much larger than a geomean. So I understand what you're saying, but I don't understand the logic of it. That doesn't mean there isn't a logic of it or a rationale, but I don't get it. And that's all I'm saying. Betraying my ignorance. Or displaying it. That's the right word.
Other comments, Dave?
So maybe two things. So one is, I would be comfortable establishing the BAFs on your analysis of just North Carolina species. That would be as protective or slightly more protective than using the entire database, if we were to pick a geometric mean. And I'd also support the use of the geometric mean, because I think where we were last time was probably each of these estimates of central tendency could be defensible. And I think in some ways, there's value in using an approach that has been used nationally by EPA and other states. And I think, to me, the difference between, say, a 2 or 3-fold difference here with respect to the geometric mean versus the average, if you look at the calculation, it probably has a minimal effect with respect to health protection at the end, by the time you look at the way that the BAF is actually being used. When you consider the uncertainty that's already embedded within an RFD and, I mean, everything else that actually exists there. I mean, we can argue how much water consumption should occur and how much food consumption is actually, I mean, every single one of those things in the calculation has a range of values. And so, again, I just don't know that this is going to be a big difference from a health protection perspective.
Yeah, there's a fair amount of uncertainty factors that are baked into the RFD before you divide it by here. And then there's not flexibility, according to questions and answer from Chris last time, in terms of it being applied to a 70 kilogram person who eats a certain amount of fish per day, which is fixed in state regulations. I think that was the basis of your suggested rephrasing, which is following an approach that's consistent with the state regulations and EPA defensible, versus how would you do it if you were doing it from whole cloth, because we didn't have the latitude to change what's in regulation regarding body weights, ingestion rates. Other comments from people? Detlef?
And it really is hard to interpret these data completely because we don't know how they were calculated. Again, the concentration of the water is a big factor in these calculations, and if it was just a grab sample, it could bias a number dramatically high or dramatically low depending on the flow condition in the river, if that was a river sample. So maybe there are outliers both on the bottom and the top end. And I don't know how these sampling campaigns are conducted, whether people wait for sort of a typical day, or probably just plan it and you do it whenever it's planned, right? They probably don't wait for an average flow day in the river.
So baked into that a little bit is that part about the granularity behind issue number 1, when we said it, relying on this data set was acceptable, is that in the Burkhart paper, which accompanies the data set, when I said, they sift all the data through 5 sieves to go from 33,000 data points down to like 5,000. They put the data into bins of high, medium, or low quality based on number of samples. And if they only had a grab sample number 1, it was considered to be low quality on that 1 of 5 endpoints. They also sorted the data based on the number of organisms. Temporal coordination, how close in time was the water sample to the fish sample. The spatial coordination, how close in location were the water and the fish. And then also general experimental design. So that for every source of data, they put 2 or 3 qualifier on those 5 parameters. And the state has decided, which I think is Paul, is what EPA did, to not use any of the data that ranked out as low quality. So on any particular data point, I don't know the answer, but across those 5 metrics for what would be considered to be maybe like an ideal sample, it was considered there. And anything that had was based on 1 sample would have been considered low quality on 1 of 5 metrics, how that averaged out across all 5. I wouldn't know.
And so I know that in order for it to be medium or high quality data, the water sample had to have been taken within, for high quality, the same time as the fish that were sampled in the river. Or medium quality would have been any time in that same calendar year the water was sampled. And so there were studies that were included in the EPA's document, referenced or either put through their sieve or not, that had water samples taken at a completely different time, but were still water data for that specific location. And those were that metric made it fall into the low quality category.
But just because it was collected, the water sample was collected on the day the fish got sampled, that doesn't mean that that's an average value for that water body.
It doesn't, but it's just I think that we think about it a little differently because of the Camor's facility and the state of the Cape Fear River at any given time. Bioaccumulation factors were not designed to be used, I think, in a situation like that where there is an influx of potential contaminants over time in different days in different states of the river. I think it's more designed to be in a water body that's consistent, and they're just trying to find what the concentration in the animals versus the water are in maybe like a steady state situation, like for mercury or lead or something that's a little more predictable and not a variable level of contamination over time.
I still think, in a river, everything varies with flow, right? And it can be a factor of 100 different easily.
That's true.
Jamie?
So I just found in one of the EPA guidance documents on aquatic life criteria, a note for why geometric means rather than arithmetic means are used. And it's because one of the reasons they give is that the distribution of individual organism sensitivities and toxicity tests on most materials and the distributions of species sensitivities within a genus are more likely to be log normal rather than normal. And so they talk about log normal distribution of results on toxicity tests. And they explain in here how geometric means are calculated. They also talk about additional information for the BAF's mean quotients, and so because a geometric mean is a quotient, it's more likely to be appropriate for how other factors are calculated.
More likely to be appropriate for how other factors are calculated.
Well, that's my language.
Oh.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I can read, in addition, division of the geometric mean of a set of numerators by the geometric mean of the set of corresponding denominators will result in the geometric mean of the set of corresponding quotients. Yeah, that makes no sense to probably most people. I would have to read it 5 more times to understand it.
Adders can multiply on a log table. That's the thing. But all of that said, it bothers me that the geomean is still so much lower than the numerical average when this happens. Now, you've got two things that are in play here, right? The reference concentration and the BAF, when you're calculating whether something's acceptable or not. And we know that the reference concentration is biased high, perhaps, by all these factors that go into it that say, uncertainty factors and the high end of the distribution and blah, blah, blah. So maybe having a geomean for the bioaccumulation factor is okay, because it's already biased high. But maybe both of those things are log normally distributed, and maybe they should be equally described by either a log normal distribution or a geomean, rather than have one be one way and one be another. So I still, to be honest, it's probably my problem, but I don't get it. I don't get it. And to say that the distribution is not normal, that's just a fact of life. So what? If you're going to do a risk calculation and an integration over the distribution, you would end up with an arithmetic average risk rather than a geomean risk, representing statewide population risk. It wouldn't be the geomean risk. It would be quite a bit lower.
It might be the most likely risk in the sense of what percentage of the population is near the geomean as opposed to this high end. But the arithmetic average would be a population average. Count every individual, measure his risk, average them out. That's the statewide population risk.
Would it affect your thinking at all to think about the context of, these data aren't from this site, they're from the world, and they're being applied statewide as opposed to a site?
Not really. I don't think that's,
Why not? It's two
that's a little smoke that's being blown on the thing.
It's the sampling isn't for a particular site, and it's not going to be.
I'm just saying that sampling's not representative, so you can't really infer sample-specific statistics from the general statistics.
Rich?
Yeah, it seems to me that the crux here is what is going to be reasonably protective. And there's concern that the geomean is not because it's lower than the average. However, I'm really drawn to your argument about being consistent across the country and other states and so forth. And also, it's like, if I understand it, I've never derived an RFD, but that the RFD has a lot of safety into it. So it is a very conservative value, correct? So for me, then that conservatism in RFD combined with the consistency of the geometric mean makes me support the geometric mean.
John?
I'm going back to, I think, Chris, it's your presentation from October where you sort of set the stage for the whole discussion here. And when I look at this and I see that the max has got 5 significant digits, it seems to me that the reference dose, which is essentially the standard, is 2 significant digits. Is that correct?
The reference dose usually does have.
2, I think.
And I don't remember what the current reference dose is.
But the state standards usually have.
Well, the state standards, we usually round them to 2 significant figures.
2 digits, okay, 2 digits. So would you be rounding this to 2 digits as well?
Well, that's a good question. I'm not sure yet how we would do that. If we would round this down to 2 digits or take it as the absolute. Yeah, I'm not sure yet. We haven't really gotten to that part to think about that.
I mean,
Yeah.
it seems to me that as you're flowing information from this into the standard, it actually would be appropriate to round things along the way. Now, again, others may have a different view, carry it through with all the significant digits. But, I think that the discussion has been really, I think, very appropriate. It sort of speaks to both the science and the policy and the math in some ways here. If you were using this for calculating cancer risk, you would use the arithmetic average. You wouldn't use the geometric average. That's how cancer risk is estimated. But the reference dose in the standard, it's a yes, no. You're either above it or you're not. It's either acceptable or it's not acceptable. It's not this sort of full range of things. So I guess I would be comfortable for the reasons that are really more policy-oriented to say that the geometric mean is consistent with the overall approach here. But I don't think we're doing cancer risk assessment here. We're really doing standards support, which is really not cancer-based. Is that correct?
Yeah, the reference dose here is not based on the carcinogenic endpoint, so we'd be looking at it as more of a systemic kind of impact.
Right. Because what's driving the difference there is clearly the really high max values. And that's a few max values, a few high values will pull that arithmetic mean up quite a bit, as you're seeing there in the numbers that you presented. I am concerned that the non-detects are not included in this, because I don't know how the precision and accuracy of the measurements that have been made here, but as you were saying, Franny, there's no measurements of PFOA because they're all non-detect. Is that right?
In the Fisherman Cave
In
River.
the Fisherman Cave River, out of how many samples?
Nearly 300, we had one that had a detectable concentration.
So the non-detects are very prominent there. And so that is an uncertainty here that comes in. You're really not able to measure it with the technology that's being used. So do you say it's a 0? No. If you set it aside, there's a bias either way. If you include it, there's a bias potentially to say you take the non-detect level, that's the method's being used, divided by 2 is oftentimes used. that would be, you know, again, one approach that's being used. I'm not sure it's the best approach, but it is a way that has been oftentimes used for these kind of data. So, you know, again, I think that either way, there is a direct relationship between these numbers, whatever the bioaccumulation factor is, and the standards, a direct, as your presentation showed back from October.
Put the equation up here again.
Yeah, there you go. There's a direct relationship there. But you see water consumption rate 2 liters per day. It's not 2.1. It's not 1.9, it's 2. So
So the values in that table, I calculated them and I just put them up exactly as they
no, I understand.
calculated.
Yeah, as they were available, that's right, so.
But those constants are defined in rule, and we talked about it the first time that we came around, that, you know, the board's usually charged with providing a range of risks to the EMC. It's hard to provide a range of risks if you can't, you know, look at what the variability in body weight is, the variability in fish consumption rate or water consumption rate, because those are fixed parameters.
You know, the size of children, for example, who tend to be higher risk.
And RFD, under the sequence of preference, is going to be, if EPA has one that's been vetted, that's the one that's going to be preferred and used. So it's
Which is intended to
the state
protect.
has flexibility for one of the multiple parameters, and you'd be driving a range of risks just based on that.
Just one last point about the non-detects. There are ways to deal with non-detects. One of them, you mentioned, half the non-detect limit is a way to assign a value to that end of the distribution. And it assumes that the distribution across the range from 0 up to the non-detects is flat, uniform, and then you get half the limit of detection as the average value. But you can infer from the high end, from above the limit of detection, something about the shape of the distribution down below it.
Not if you only have one value out of 300, though.
No, I mean, you have to have a distribution.
That's right.
You have to have some variability
work
there. And you can do a pretty good job of estimating that it's going to have a positive slope and what it's going to be. So you could fold those back in. You don't have to just completely ignore them, non-detect.
But in the EPA document, they chose not to do that, is what I understand. It chose to just not include.
I don't know why they did that.
Well, they didn't meet their data quality objectives, which is you had to have measured values with confidence in all those. And so I brought it up in the context of it does help you think about what direction it would be, in addition to being skewed by, you know, really high detects. It could also be skewed by the absence of undetects. Two last comments, then I'm going to suggest we either regroup after a break, or that we entertain a motion. And while you guys are commenting, please bring up the last charge question again so that people can be thinking about how they might frame a vote around that charge question. David?
I think it's worth noting that had they tried to use an approach like LOD divided by 2 to come up with a numeric value for non-detect, or any other approach, would just drive those geometric means and averages lower.
That's right.
So it's almost a moot point for us from a health protection perspective as to whether they were included or not, because the values that we're talking about should be protective had those non-detects. I mean, I just don't want the public hearing something about this discussion about non-detects and have the wrong impression that somehow the value we're discussing is not as protective because the non-detects were not considered.
I think you make a very good point. It would tend to pull them down. It's just the rationale, I haven't described that here, that I'm aware of, yeah.
And Detlef?
Also related to the non-detects and really the bioaccumulation factor is a ratio. And so you might have had a non-detect in fish and a really low detect in water, and it just doesn't allow you to calculate a bioaccumulation factor. It's not that we're assessing really the distribution of PFOS or PFOA in fish and assigning a distribution to that, where I think it might be appropriate to just exclude the non-detects because it's for the purpose of the bioaccumulation factor. And if, like, let's say we have a very low concentration in water, and then you have to assign let's say the reporting limit over 2 for the tissue, and I guess you could calculate a bioaccumulation factor that way, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the bioaccumulation factor would be really, really low compared to what's being reported. Right? It's the ratio.
Yeah, it would introduce another source of uncertainty, and the absence of excluding them doesn't mean that there's not low values in the data set. All right, I think it's a helpful discussion, and we've got helpful discussions like this each of the last 3 times that we've talked in terms of things for the state to consider, and it's an advisory board. The state has the benefit of all that advice. It's sometimes good to sum up where we are, whether it's consensus or whether there's any outlying opinions, and we can continue to talk after a break, or we could entertain a motion on, after getting to yes and yes on 1 and 2 in previous meetings, if there's a motion to be considered for number 3. That'd be a good time to try to sew it up.
So you want me to say I move that we say yes and then put it to a vote? Is that what you're asking?
If you're inclined to agree with number 3, then a motion that would say that would be appropriate, so that we can take it from discussion to action.
So moved.
Is there a second?
Second.
And do you want to say again what it is, just so that we can make sure it was quiet, just to make sure that it got heard by others?
Well, so I think the motion is, do we agree or not agree that the EPA's method of using the geometric mean is scientifically sound? Right?
Mm-hmm.
And then the vote would just be agree, disagree, I would assume.
Yeah. And you're okay with that?
So your motion again is what? It's just,
Just rephrasing number 3.
you're not saying yes or no. You're just saying, is that the appropriate?
Do we agree? Does the board agree with that statement?
All right. Yeah, I'm good with that.
Does the board agree that EPA's method of using the geometric mean as the BAF?
Scientifically sound.
Okay.
Can I ask a clarifying question?
We have a motion and a second? Yeah, so now we're in discussion. Go ahead.
Dave, you mentioned about the preference for the North Carolina specific versus all species. Is that part of your motion?
No, because it's just discussing the use of the geometric mean. I would assume, I'm not sure that the discussion of whether we should truncate the data to North Carolina is in 1 or 2.
It's in number 2.
Number 2. Already been, yeah.
It's in number 2.
It is.
That
We
was
already
the
decided
state's
that.
method.
Right.
Okay. That was from the last meeting.
It was, yeah.
All right.
Any other discussion about the motion that's on the table?
So one thing this was a discussion about the below detects. So by excluding them, then if anything, the derived BF is more protective, correct?
That's correct.
That's correct.
And that's the point that David wanted to make sure
I think
that.
so.
I guess it depends on the numerator or denominator.
Right, exactly. You might make your denominator smaller, right? And-
Right, which would make the
Yeah,
best
yeah.
persuasive.
So I don't know that we can predict it since it's already shown.
I would say we don't know.
We don't know.
Gotcha. Any other discussion about the motion that's on the floor?
Do we have to say scientifically sound, or
Yeah, I
can
don't
we say
like that.
appropriate?
Just say appropriate.
Yeah.
Skip the scientifically sound.
That's a good point.
So we're going to scratch scientifically sound for appropriate.
If you're willing to modify your motion, I
So
suppose.
I'll modify my motion in that way. You willing to second it?
I'll second it.
So we have the motion that would be paraphrased as, is the method of using the geometric mean as borrowed from EPA appropriate for this context? Any discussion around that? All right, all in favor? Aye? Aye. Anyone opposed?
I'm going to abstain on this one.
Anyone abstaining? One abstain. All right, noted. Good job. And keep in mind that all that context that I was going through about the reasons behind the yeses is in recordings that are referenced in minutes with the timestamp. Somebody can go listen to all of that. Chris, who takes this forward to the EMC, has heard all of it in person. Thank you for sitting through it and hope it's been beneficial. And now, before we break, just let us know, is this the end of it? Or do you need something in writing that documents the foundation of these decisions?
Yes, thank everyone for all of your conversations. They've been very helpful, since this is something that will play into development of water quality standards and something that will go into the making process before the commission and out to the public. It would be very helpful to have a summary of the SSAB's decisions and supporting information.
And I'll say, something that you and Franny can work on to summarize what you've heard with me. Because like when I paraphrased, I was like, I think I know from the combination of the criteria documents and the paper what the state was pulling from those. And I also know from the board's feedback how we got to yes on those. And I think it would be important to capture that granularity, including things like changes in wording and motions, and Dave's point about following policy being appropriate versus, maybe the way that you would do it from scratch, from whole cloth. And so can you all work on that together with me to bring it back, and then we can have a summary document that will put an end to this one, that basically just summarizes the conversations and votes.
Yes.
Great.
Yeah, I'd actually like to change my vote to abstain as well.
Okay.
It's the math issue. I'm still a little bit uncertain about the non-detects. I'm just concerned about that enough because I hadn't really thought about the numerator versus the denominator.
It makes a difference.
It does make a difference, yeah.
And that ET&C paper by Larry Burkhart, I think I forwarded that along with the criteria documents for which I provided links to early on. It's a pretty good read because the criteria documents tend to take the conclusions from the paper and say, here's what we're going to do. The ET&C publication talks about the derivation of the data set, the origin of the data quality sieves, and even before the data quality sieves was the step about the non-detects being excluded. So they may find something there about that.
I'll link that.
That wasn't for application, that was EPA's summary of the data, and then the criteria documents had to make decisions like this about now how do we use that data. So I think it's a helpful source on the compilation of the data set, whereas the criteria documents were more of an application of the data set.
Just a comment, though, I understand the concern, but in some ways it also goes against how we voted with respect to item 1. Because we supported the use of the EPA literature, which includes the non-detect. So, is the issue really the math, or is it just that EPA literature is incomplete? And I would say, and again, that's however folks vote and are concerned about it, that's there. But it just seems like once we said for one, using EPA literature, warts and all, is kind of, we addressed that back in December.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, ton of homework to synthesize all that and pull it together in those papers. 33,000 data points. Anything else? All right. Well, after the break, let's see. Want to come back at 10 till? Does that seem reasonable? Betsy is going to handle the chair duties for the rest of the day. Thank you. And I'll thank all of you for your participation coming today. Thanks very much. And remind you that if you have topics that you'd like to see considered or brought up, send Franny or I a note. So thanks so much. See you back in a few minutes.
So you're leaving right?
Reconvening after our break. This is, for those of you listening, this is Dr. Betsy Tilson, the State Health Director, taking over the chair role just for the rest of this meeting. Appreciate you all coming back. The second part of our agenda are informational, so there's no actions or decisions we actively need to make for the second part of the agenda. There'll be 2 informational items, both from our colleagues at DEQ, and then we will also have time for a public forum, and we'll just double check to see if anybody has requested that public forum before we adjourn. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Julie from DEQ to do our first informational item, which will be MCL updates on PFOA and PFAS.
Okay. And probably many of you are familiar and you saw EPA's reports during the past couple of weeks, but I'll go over a little bit of what the EPA's proposed MCLs are for PFOA and PFOA, and discuss a little bit what DEQ and DWR specifically is doing in this area. So first, you probably know in June of 2022, EPA did release some health advisory levels for the following 4 PFAS. And it's helped informed what the maximum contaminant level goals or the MCLGs would be, which are not regulatory and are lower than the proposed MCLs. You may all know that MCLGs are the maximum level of a contaminant in drinking water where there are no known or anticipated negative health effects, and it does allow for a margin of safety in that calculation. MCLs are the maximum contaminant levels, and they are regulatory values. And so in March, they did come out with MCLs. And most of you may be familiar with this, but PFOA and PFOS were at 4 parts per trillion. And then they took 4 of the PFAS, and they came up with something called a hazard index. And I'll show you what that calculation is next, how one calculates hazard index. So the proposed rule would require public water systems to monitor, of course, for PFAS, both in community and non-transient, non-community systems. And they would, the MCLs measured at the entry point, and that's where the water enters the distribution system. It has notification requirements in it, or annual reports for the consumer confidence reports. And then if in 30 days, they have to notify any customers if they exceed the MCLs. They are required to reduce the levels of these PFAS in drinking water if they exceed the proposed standards. And when they exceed, it's based on a running annual average. So they do quarterly sampling. They average to 4 quarters. If it's above the MCL, that's when they exceed it. And they keep that running average going each quarter. The hazard index is the concentration that they measure of that PFAS over the health-based value. And that's how you calculate it. You add those up. And if they're greater than 1, you consider that you're exceeding the MCL. So in North Carolina, we have greater than 5,000 public water systems that serve greater than 7 million residents. Public water supply is generally defined as 15 connections, or that it either has 15 connections or it serves 25 people during a period of 60 days. And we have about 1,900 community water systems and 325 non-transient, non-community systems. That's like schools, where it's not their primary drinking water. But they spend the whole day there, day after day. So in 2019, the PFAS network sampled 326 public water supplies for PFAS. This is the collaboratory. And we took a look at that data. We only had available to us that 1 quarter, that 1 sample. And so we looked at all the 326 samples for those PWS. And we found that we had 50 public water supplies that had detections above 4 parts per trillion for both PFOA and or PFOS. So in 2022, DEQ resampled those 50 public water supplies for those parameters. 42 had either PFOS and or PFOA above 4 parts per trillion, and 8 had either no detections or PFOA and PFOS below 4 parts per trillion. So this is what the collaboratory's monitoring sampling looked like across the state of the 326 systems. But you can see it covered a good variety and portion of the whole state. And then we went and sampled those 50 public water supplies, and this is a map of our results. So the blue, so we had 31 systems that had PFOA greater than 4 parts per trillion. Okay, that's the stars. We had 38 systems that had PFOS greater than 4 parts per trillion, and that is the blue circles. And then, of course, we had 42 systems with PFOA or PFOS greater than 4 parts per trillion. And some of them were both. Okay, so DEQ has developed plans to sample additional water systems to assess the levels of PFAS on a statewide scale. Well, when I say that, we're talking about a lot of the non-transient, non-community systems that are smaller systems where they don't have usually the funds or the money to do such sampling like schools. And so we would like to take a look at that a little bit more closely. And then DEQ will continue to provide technical assistance and support public water suppliers to help them identify and reduce PFAS in drinking water. We're trying to help them talk about it, how to understand it, how to explain it to the customers. Pretty complicated issues. We have UMC 5 coming up for the Safe Drinking Water Act. It'll start sampling and have started through 2022 through 26. So all 6 of these PFAS are in that sampling requirement. So we'll get to see a lot of results from water supplies. And by the way, in these slides, I'm including both surface water and groundwater. These are just whatever their water supply is. So in March 2023, you know that there was a proposed contaminant levels rule. It expects to be finalized in late 2023, and then systems would have 3 years to achieve these MCLs. The compliance point is where the finished water enters the distribution system. And of course, like I said earlier, they would sample quarterly, and they must show that they're running average at less than the MCL. And EPA has some FAQs on that website listed below. Some other general information is that bipartisan infrastructure law provides $9 billion to invest in drinking water systems specifically impacted by PFAS. And states and communities can also leverage an additional nearly $12 billion in the Drinking Water State Revolving Loan Fund, a bill, it's called BIL, dedicated to making drinking water safe. In North Carolina, many residents are not connected to public water supplies or community water systems, and they receive their drinking water from private drinking wells. And the private wells are not protected by MCLs and are not tested at the same frequency that public water supplies are. So DEQ is pursuing some funding options to support these residents. Just like we saw around Comoras, they had to really struggle to get taken care of. But many are not going to be around Comoras and be impacted, and we're concerned about that, trying to look for funding methods. A few more key points. DEQ is working with water systems on meeting all regulatory requirements and sharing data. DEQ will continue to collect data from systems across the state. And the proposed MCLs rulemaking are a first step in concrete solutions to a problem we have only recently begun to fully understand. Again, here's just some more information to help understanding PFAS. We also have online all our data, and when we collect it and get the QA/QC it, go through it, we will continue to put it up on our website. We also put up for users the simple in-home filtration systems that they can purchase to help reduce the PFAS levels and what removal rates they can achieve, and help local governments know where they might be able to find funding to clean up PFAS. And that's it.
Thank you. Open it up to the board for questions, please.
I do have a few questions. So the first one is, we talked about the hazard index, and since we've just been talking about how do you handle non-detects, what's the guidance for handling non-detects in that calculation?
0, I think. Yeah, I think that's it. I'm sure we're going to see comments in the public comment period on that to ask that question.
And then I guess second question would be, Based on the collaboratory testing, and then, you all went back and tested 50 public water systems that had detections that were over 4 previously, are there any requirements for those water systems to notify their customers that they're over?
So, not that I'm aware of. And I'm substituting for Rebecca Sadowski, who is our expert in this area. But I do not believe there's any requirement that since the point of the new proposed regulations, that notification levels would be required in there. Though a lot of communities have been very transparent. We've seen the smaller systems like Aqua and other communities put that data up on their website. They may not always put all of it, but they seem to, with their own reasoning, put certain PFAS up there.
And then one last question that was kind of near the end, but when you're talking about filtration systems, if you have, if a customer or a person with a private well has PFAS over, that they can install filtration, how do you handle those filters after they've concentrated PFAS now? I've read that they have to be handled essentially as hazardous waste. You can't just throw them in the garbage and have them sent to a landfill. So how would a private system, a private customer know how to handle that?
Well, I think we'll try and put up information on the website to address that. As of right now, it's not considered a hazardous waste in any way.
Okay, so at least in North Carolina, it's not at this time.
That's correct.
All right, thank you.
One quick question. The hazard quotient that you calculate, no single chemical needs to exceed the ratio of 1 individually, right? They could all be less than 1.
If any of them exceed their health-based value, then they're going to exceed 1.
Right. But they could all be less than 1 and still
Add up to greater than
cause a
1.
problem.
Yeah.
Cumulative.
Which kind of gets at the very beginning, our conversation about this kind of additive. There's a lot of PFAS in there, so it's kind of getting at that concept.
It's an interesting question. Yesterday at that workshop that Kennedy was also mentioning, and Tom, there was some discomfort with that idea, but it's not without precedence in drinking water regulations. Like, for example, for disinfection byproducts, there's maximum contaminant limits for individual disinfection byproducts, and then also a group maximum contaminant level for the sum of 4 and 5, depending on the subclass. And so you might be in violation of the sum standard, while you might still be okay with the concentration of the individual disinfection byproduct. There's, in the literature now, pretty nice experimental evidence that for at least disinfection byproducts, there's additive toxicity. So you can look at the calculated toxicities for the individual species and then create a mixture and analyze the toxicity of the mixture in cytotoxicity assays using Chinese hamster overcell. Actually very good agreement between the added calculated toxicities and the measured whole water toxicity.
For the same toxic endpoint across the 4.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
Not for the PFAS.
Not for the PFAS.
For the
no, I mean,
disinfection.
There's another leap there that you have to make.
Yeah, I'm talking about more in the sense of precedence, and
Right.
that there's beginning evidence of that additivity is maybe not an unreasonable approach or assumption for maybe compounds in a given class. But yeah, I know it's hard to and the read across concept, I guess, is always, and additivity is always up for debate.
Sushma had a comment. Oh.
And Chris, for surface water, don't we do it for phenolic compounds too? Is that it yet?
We have a number of surface water standards that basically just consider groups, chlorinated, benzenes, phenolic compounds. A lot of those are older, back when we didn't have a lot of information on the specific variations of compounds, but there's kind of that same precedent. But I think that the use of the hazard index was really interesting. I think with the EPA trying to respond to people's request to look at PFAS as a class of compounds. So it's kind of an interesting way to do it.
Sushma had a comment.
Yeah, I just wanted to add a few thoughts. Thank you, Julie. I believe two of the facilities that she identified, I think of the total 43 or so, were brought in because of the hazard index. Individually, they had PFOA and PFOS were below the proposed MCL, but when you look at the hazard index, they were above 1, and that's why those facilities the sites are in the total mix. I would also say that our data were collected over a 3-month period over grab samples for each of the months. So EPA requires a more rigorous monitoring and sampling in order to assess which water systems are going to be needing further compliance. And that's all going to begin after the rules finalized and 3-year period before they have to put in appropriate solutions. So just a caveat that our data was limited to just 3 months, and we're basing a lot of our education, outreach, and connections with the operators based on that. And then finally, I would say that even though the operations are required to comply in 3 years, we think there's a window as a state for us to do as much as we can. And so from our department, as Julie mentioned, we're talking with the operators. And also there's a review of, well, what is causing that contamination? You know, is it an ongoing? Is it, are there sources that are contributing to that? And are they point sources? Are they non-point sources? What can we do to address that today so that the burden to the treatment system is perhaps reduced? So all that work will need to continue in the coming months.
I wonder if you could put the map up that you showed that had the distribution of samples that were being taken, the one before that. So, that is a nice distribution, but in the area north of Raleigh-Durham where Warren County is, where there's been historically a big concern about environmental justice, it doesn't look like there's any sampling up there at all. Why is that?
I don't know, the collaboratory made that decision. So
I can answer that since these data were collected in our lab, in Lee Ferguson's lab at Duke. So we focused on municipal and county water systems. So only municipal and county water systems. If the area is relatively sparse, that means it's mostly private wells in that area, or these very small community public water systems that are not classified as municipal or county. So I think that's where the DEQ effort is actually coming in, because there are many additional public water systems that we didn't consider. So we looked at 376.
And it's an impressive distribution, but there seems to be pretty clearly a gap there in an area that we know historically has had problems. So.
I'm actually in conversations with people in Franklin County, and there are concerns in that area. It's surprising. There's quite a few places in areas that we didn't expect necessarily.
Another comment is, if you go to the next slide, I think is the one that you're talking about, millions of people there exposed to levels that exceed the 4 parts per trillion. So it really speaks to, I think, a need for a really effective communication strategy. So is that in play right now, or is that going to be developed as part of the rollout of the sampling analysis results to the communities? Because there's going to be public awareness of this soon. So
that is the hardest part of our job. But yes, we are constantly working on that, trying to roll this out, not to alarm people, but to make sure they understand what the MCLs really represent and what we measured.
So you have a very effective risk communicator sitting right next to me here. She did a great job with
we could use all the help we can get.
I'll say, and jointly DEQ and DHS, we've been talking through this, and really this, and actually what we were talking about earlier is this idea of, there's not a bright line between safe and unsafe. And that we know the lower the number, the better. There are things we can put into place to lower that amount. We'll continue to be gathering data and continuing to work with our water supplies and lowering the levels. So we have lots of FAQs and materials out there. It's, and it's this, and then the other piece is that there is not a recommendation to go to bottled water.
Right.
Because we actually don't know how much PFOA and PFAS are in bottled water. Many of them come from municipal waters, so very different than Keymore.
So those living in Raleigh are fortunate. Those living in Durham, where I live, I'm concerned. I hadn't seen that before, so.
Yeah.
Well, actually, Raleigh is actually often above 4 also. We're working with Raleigh right now.
Okay.
So I sent an email to Sushma and Julie just now, like
Okay.
a couple systems that need to be added because when we did the original 376 sites, going to the fish discussion, so like sometimes we sample during a storm.
Right.
And so the PFAS and PFOA were diluted out and it looked really low, but most of the days it's not.
Sampling strategy.
That's why I'm glad we're got the UCMR5 data too.
Yeah.
That would be helpful.
And then the other point is, sorry.
That's all right, go ahead.
Quite a few of the utilities are already planning for treatment. So like Greensboro is well underway, Fayetteville is well underway, Pittsburgh has already carbon installed, Wilmington has carbon installed, Brunswick County is working.
Carbon, granulated carbon.
Granular carbon is probably the common option that will be chosen. WASA is working on it. Raleigh is, already working hard on getting below 4 with a very quick fix. So they will probably be able to do that.
Lots of federal infrastructure money
Right.
coming down that will help support this as well. Sorry, I think I took.
You could stratify this by looking at gradations above 4. I'd be interested to know how many of these are above 8, how many of them are above 16, how many above 32. Can you do that?
We have done it, and I don't know it offhand, but we did look at 20 one time, and most of them were below, I want to say at least 18 or 20 easily. There was not a lot of high numbers of it, which is good news.
Comments or questions? I will just end by saying that I think the infrastructure that we have in North Carolina with the collaboratory, with a lot of the focus already on PFAS, I think it really puts us ahead a lot of the country. And it's scary to see, but we have data where some other states haven't even done this infrastructure to even know their starting point. So although it may look scary, I think North Carolina is really in a better place than many because of all this infrastructure and partnership that we've already put into place. Part of that communication piece as well, but I think we're in a much better place than a lot of states. And a lot of Secretary Regan's, he is now the administrative EPA, had been the Secretary of DEQ, and with the silver lining, I think, of Keymore's was really highlighting this and put us in a much better position to start responding.
And I'll add, we're already putting it in NPDES permit. It's not a limit, but the monitoring requirement, as soon as 1633, the wastewater test gets approved. And not that we haven't seen data from a lot of the point sources, but we're going to make it so that we get a lot more and using the right test as soon as it becomes available. Thank you.
Thank you, Julie. And then I think it's on to Franny for the other comments. Great, for our next informational item.
So the presentation I'm about to give, the first 2 slides you've seen before, but we're going to walk back through the PFAS that were detected in the media in North Carolina and which PFAS is next for our toxicological evaluation that we actually just completed with PFMOA. To start, I just want to highlight the importance of reference doses in our standards development. For pretty much every rule we have, we need a reference dose. For groundwater, the reference dose is all we need. For surface water, we need the reference dose and the bioaccumulation factor or the bioconcentration factor. And then for drinking water, we need the reference dose and this technology assessment. And often that comes from the EPA directly. DHHS also needs the reference dose to do any kind of a fish consumption advisory. You've seen these slides before, but these are the top 20 PFAS that were detected in all media in North Carolina. So air, water, soil, sediment, groundwater, surface water. From that very large table I presented about a year and a half ago, this is kind of the synopsis. I have these separated out by the 9 PFAS that the EPA roadmap is going to cover, and those that the EPA roadmap will not include. The 2 colors here indicate either a legacy PFAS, which is the dark green, or a lighter green, which is the emerging or consent order PFAS. We identified the top 5 PFAS in surface water bodies across North Carolina. So this is data collected from the Division of Waste Management. And there were more than 5. I just excluded them from these pie charts so they were easier to see. But you can see that PFMOAA was, I'll orient you first. There are 3 pie charts. They're from a boat ramp downstream, closer to Comores in the Cape Fear River, downstream from the Cape Fear River, and then an average of residential well water. The same colors are representative of the same PFAS across all 3 of these pie charts. So the dark green is PFMOAA, and so you can see that's in all 3 of these, and that was the reason we started with that. It was the leading compound in most of our water bodies. The next few are not represented in every water body, but there are some consistencies across them. And so what I did here was I highlighted those top 5 in the non-EPA roadmap PFAS group that I just showed you. And so these 5 PFAS are our priority group 1. And so they're not being regulated as a group. These are just the first 5 individually that we're looking for in terms of toxicity information and the potential to derive a reference dose. We know that these are all specific to North Carolina and the water bodies. We've sampled them. And we know there's not a lot of toxicity information for these. So this is a slide that I showed you in June of last year. And so at the time, this was what our literature searching had found, that PFMOAA had 2 toxicity references and some human biomonitoring studies. But for the most part, everything else had no literature at the time. It has actually changed a little bit. And so we improved our search strategy, which is a very, now it's a very automated thing, whereas before it was manual. And so we were actually able to find one specific reference from 2019 that had PFO2HXA and PFO3OA in it as far as a toxicity study. And then there were a few more toxicity publications for PFO3OA. One of them just came out at the end of last year. And so as you can see, even with our improved search strings and the automation we've put in place, there is still a paucity of information for these. Yes, sir.
So when you say toxicology, does that include computational toxicology?
No.
No, okay.
Yeah, the CompTox papers that I included, that I included in that, that big table, they were all using these consent order compounds kind of with Gen X as a proxy for all of them. But those are really the only computational papers that are done for a lot of these to this point. We have been in communication with the EPA about how to use these NAMs, these new approach methodologies for regulation. And to be honest, I'm the slowest wheel in that particular chain. And so I'm due to communicate with Rusty about that a little more. Yes, sir.
So why are those 5 compounds unique to North Carolina?
These are all from Comores.
I'm sorry?
These are from Comores. These are consent order
These are
compounds.
just strictly from Comores, so.
Yes, as far as we know, these are consent order compounds. Yes, sir.
Can I suggest maybe for the next meeting, we might want to have someone from the CompTox program from EPA come and, just for all of our benefit, just describe what their areas of emphasis are, how they're anticipating people using those new methods for evaluating chemicals, particularly when you're looking at a hazard index approach that was talked about earlier, is that may help inform a hazard index approach down the road at some point. So it's just a suggestion.
Yeah, no, that's a great suggestion. And Kennedy and I actually were talking about the hazard index approach when they released it last month. Because it does give us this precedent for doing something to that effect for compounds that we have little toxicity information for, but have the same mechanistic pathway. So it's, yes, I think that's a good idea.
I'll suggest that to the chair too.
Yes.
Okay.
And so PFO2HXA would be the next most concentrated compound in our surface water bodies. There's just that one publication. And then PFO3OA would be the next one. One of the publications talks about both of them. And so for all intents and purposes, we're going to move to O3OA, but the results corresponding to PFO2HXA will also be put in the slide. So these are the 3 toxicology publications that we have right now in the literature, PFO3OA. One is on mice, one is on zebrafish embryos, and the other is using the blood samples collected in the GenX exposure study comparing them to lipid biomarkers. As far as the toxicology review plan goes, so I spent a lot of time talking to Chairperson Oxberger about this and how I can do more work on the front end to make this an easier evaluation on your part, and how we can move through this list of compounds with little information a little more efficiently. And so the first step is for me to review them all in detail and summarize the findings in these slides. And then I'm going to evaluate the methodology and rank them based on quality, like I asked the board to do. And I'm going to use one of those 2 official guidelines that I had sent. I haven't looked at either of those in detail recently, and so I haven't decided which one I'm going to use, but that is the plan, for me to present all of that information at one time. And solicit your feedback and recommendations moving forward. So what I'll say is that I have not done this in-depth review of these publications at this point. I have a very brief summary of the 3, and then I will follow this up in June with the more in-depth analysis or summary. Yes, sir.
Can I ask can you go back to the titles of the 3?
Yes.
So what might save you time is for us as a board to discuss whether or not we're going to support standard development based on either lipid outcomes or zebrafish data.
Yes.
Because, I mean, is there really a value added to you going through all those steps for that if we're going to turn around and say that may not be useful for deriving a standard?
That would be very helpful. And so I have a brief summary of the results, and I think once I tell you kind of what the results found very briefly, it'll help that particular discussion. But I guess it's more whether or not zebrafish are useful in this particular outcome before we talk about it.
So I think, again, I think a discussion with some of the folks from the CompTox program who are trying to think through how to use alternative methods. I do believe that includes a group that some of the zebrafish work as well. At least one of the labs there does that zebrafish well. And, are they viewing that as a way to do sort of relative potency? Are they looking at just yes, no, maybe there's a research opportunity here? What is it being considered for, these kind of methods? So
Sure, but then I guess this always goes back to what are there requirements within the state, or either not specific requirements, but exactly, what's the historical norm for developing these types of standards? Right. There's a theoretical, yes, you can do lots of stuff, and I think I'm actually pretty aware of that. Right. But rubber hits the road. Study 1 in male mice may be we ran into this before. I'm just trying to understand whether it could be for us to have that discussion first rather than do a lot of effort and then we come back and go, oh, well, I don't think we really would support using zebrafish or, a biomarker, and, just trying to save Franny's time a little bit.
Well, it may be that using historical norms, right, is not necessarily going to be applicable. And so understanding the range of alternative approaches, be it computational toxicology, be it these other fish, and having that input So maybe before Franny does
That's
anything.
too much time, man.
Right,
Certainly
then-
male mice is a good one.
Yeah, right, but these other two, then understanding if the computational toxicology group is also, if they have a broader range of alternative methods that are different than historical methods, is it worth thinking through that before Franny?
But these publications don't reflect NAMs. They don't. I mean, because your search wasn't actually looking for mechanistic outcomes.
It
So-
didn't exclude it, but these are just straight toxicology.
So, I mean, that's the other issue, is if you're going to try to look at the entire database and consider, things like mechanistic data or,
Explodes on you.
Right, then you need to expand your search. So again, that comes back to, do we want to put a lot of effort into that if at the end of the day, the driver is going to be, say, study 1 in male mice? And I think we could have some of that discussion earlier rather than later.
So not to have Dr. Nielsen do more work, but it's only 3 articles, and maybe the discussion could occur after we see her assessment of the quality of the data from these 3 articles, and then we could say, well, clearly zebrafish, the quality are low, or clearly the male mouse quality, the male mouse study quality is poor. If it was 50 articles, maybe we would want to save the time, but it's only 3. And there may be a few more based on new approaches or talks, but you said your search included all possible studies that could be found with these chemicals?
Yes, and so the table I showed is perhaps a little disingenuous because it only shows the toxicology and the biomonitoring studies where there are a lot of methods development and surface water sampling papers that came up for these compounds, but they're not kind of relevant to this particular discussion. So there's more coming through our searches, but these are just the toxicology papers that are coming through.
And there were none in your search that would include tox, cell-based, in silico, new approaches for these compounds?
It wouldn't exclude it. And so it was just general toxicology kind of endpoints, like I can't remember exactly, but I can put it in the next presentation I give. And so it shouldn't exclude any of it if typical toxicology terminology is used in the title, abstract, or in the introduction of the paper.
So I agree with Dr. Dorman in terms of, we want to save work for you if we're just going to go back to what is tried and true. But since there's only a few studies, is it worth her time to give us her assessment of their quality before we have the discussion of including or excluding a
Well, I would
particular
worry
study?
about applicability before I worried about quality.
I have an
If
idea.
the study's not applicable, because you're not going to use it to derive a regulatory number, even if it's high or low quality, if it's not applicable, you're not going to use it. So, I mean, I guess you're right. I mean, it's 3 papers, so, but it's just,
Is there anything that says we can't include a study from a zebrafish or
we've struggled
hamster
doing,
cell?
we've struggled doing that before.
I have an idea. And so I think to get at the point of both of that both of you are making is that I can at the next meeting I can give a presentation about all of the typical or often used toxicology model species and what their potential drawbacks or anything like that are, and we can weigh in on which kinds of models would be most appropriate. There's not that many, and rodents are most appropriate, certainly. I can also reach out to the EPA and find out which kinds of data they're using as the input for a lot of their NAMs, and if it is, they do have a very robust zebrafish lab at the EPA. And so they may be using zebrafish information in a way that is not historically used. And so I think that kind of information could shade the way you weigh in about those particular models, or some combination of all 3 of those things.
I think there is a aspiration that the new alternative models will be applied to support decision-making, where the decision-making is what are the research priorities on one side versus what is a regulatory thou shalt not exceed this level. There's this whole range there that goes on. And the idea has been to try to support those programs. A lot of money and resources has gone into it. You said Rusty Thomas's group. I would like to hear from them. Well, where are the applications of this as they see it? Is it on the research, mechanisms of toxicity side? Are they seeing some insights coming in towards prioritization among chemicals? But I think the answer is yes. Is there actually applications? But I think there's been Deepwater Horizon, maybe it's the only one that's ever happened. But are there, where are they seeing it? Because they should be totally on top of not just North Carolina, but the whole country and the world, really. Where is this world going? Because, I agree with you, David, that, the history has been, in the criteria of pollutants, it's got to be either human exposure studies or epidemiology. It drives the whole thing. Toxicology is very much down here in terms of priority. IRIS assessments, it's the animal toxicology drives it typically, with some cases where there's occupational studies, and this gives some insights. But I think as we look to the range of things that people are exposed to, particularly here, whether it's this or PCBs or something, where there's a huge mixture of things people are exposed to, people are concerned that the answer at this point has been, if we don't have a value, if we don't have something, the answer is there's zero risk. And that's a concern. So I think that there may be insights here that we can help. Nothing else to set priorities for the state in terms of the research community. Here's where we have a concern, but I don't think we have a very good feeling of that landscape right now. And I think that's been developing very rapidly. So that's why I'm kind of encouraging that we get some input, maybe for the next meeting or the meeting after that, whatever's working out.
So the challenge there, part of the challenge there is that EPA is, as you well know, has got a regulatory arm to it.
Right.
REACH, and the way the Europeans are using some of this data may actually be more robust right now compared to what we're doing here domestically. It's just a point that I was, like on face value, not even looking at the data, one of the concerns you'll run into is we don't have swim bladders. So
sure.
That's,
I don't.
Well, we don't. That open, so let's, again, hypothetically, let's say that turns out to be a strong study, and we can say, well, thyroid hormone disruption is important in both mammals and aquatic species. But, eventually, you're going to have to be able to defend generation of a number based on an organ effect that may not be actually important in humans. And so I think we keep hitting this. It's like, oh, NAMs are going to do, and the reality is there's more talk about NAMs than there's actual applications. And I just think we need to be careful as a board not to necessarily create a lot of work in which we might just come back and go, well, you know what? Male mice, yeah, we know how to deal with that. That's what happened with Gen X. We went back to the rodent models when we were trying to drive values for and we said we're going to use that type of an approach. So I'm all for trying to use alternatives, but it's just I don't want to spend months again discussing stuff and then come back and go, well, we can do something with the male mice. Because if we know that's where we're going to end up in 6 months, let's do it, because that's more health protective than having discussions about alternatives that we don't actually use.
Well, but we don't actually use it. I think our role is not only to help set standards. I think it's also to help the state in terms of what should we monitor for? What should the state be looking for? What should the state prioritize in terms of the resources the state has? So that's where I guess I'm viewing a larger set of information to be useful for us to consider here. I understand your point. Yeah, if you're going to set a standard, tried and true is kind of where people go because it's defensible.
Right.
It's defensible because of a long history of that. But I don't think that's our only role here, too. So
one of the things that I've been working on is putting together a list of all of the state standards and advisories for PFAS. The vast majority, and I don't want to say all because I haven't gotten through the entire list, the vast majority of states rely on traditional toxicological data and mostly data from rodent studies. However, North Carolina is a leader when it comes to uncovering PFAS, and as Dr. Tilson has said, we can continue to be a leader in setting standards and considering effective and new approaches for appropriately protecting the public.
Franny, did you have more in the presentation, or was this?
I have a few more slides.
took you aside there.
No, this was really important. So maybe you want to finish up, and then we can circle back.
You're in charge.
Finish up, circle back. I'm mindful of the time, and then we can think about what we want for next steps.
You have the gavel.
Okay, so the first publication from 2019 is the male mice study, and it's kind of a normal dosing study. It's 28 days. They did 3 doses. They demonstrated that both PFO2-HXA and O3OA exposure did not induce increased relative liver weight. However, PFO4DA, which is number 6 on North Carolina's list, did increase liver weight. The second paper is the zebrafish paper. They used zebrafish embryos and compared developmental toxicity compared to PFOA. The EC50 values showed that PFO5 ODA was the most toxic, followed by O4DA, followed by PFOA, which was the metric for comparison, and then PFO3OA was the least toxic of those that they tested. They did find that exposure significantly lowered thyroid hormone and T4 in the whole body following this thyroid disruption. And so PFO5DA and O4DA are the next 2 on North Carolina's list, and so this paper will appear again. Yes, it's just thyroid dysfunction, essentially, that PFO3OA is eliciting. The third paper is the one that was recently published. This is the blood samples from the Gen X exposure study that took place in Wilmington. They used the blood samples from that study, analyzed for 20 PFAS, and they found that PFO3OA was one of the least frequently detected in those human samples at 28% of those human samples. And so they did not include it in any further statistical analyses. So there really is no data to use from this paper for this particular compound. That's not exactly true for the rest of the compounds they looked at, but for this one, they didn't do any stats. So, just one more time, if we choose to go this route, I will review them, rank them, and present them, and then that'll be at the next meeting, unless we decide that something else is more appropriate. But that was my last slide.
It's really only 2.
Yeah, it's only 2 papers, and it sounds like if the EPA is doing things with the zebrafish, it might be at least good to understand how they're using that and whether or not it's applicable or not before we, and especially if it's more the thyroid than the bladder.
Yeah, I like that idea of having someone from the CompTox group come and talk to us about their path forward.
And specifically, if it's a zebrafish piece, how they are using that.
These non-traditional.
That's right.
Okay.
Is that, go ahead, David.
I like that.
You have the gavel.
No, I'm deferring, I'm soliciting input from you.
I'm good. I'm good, either way.
Okay. So there's only 2, we'll have a little bit more. You will either get feedback from the EPA or maybe even better, we could see if we could have them join us remotely or, I don't know, maybe even in person to understand.
Yeah. Their CompTox group is mostly based in RTP.
Oh,
so they could potentially, I'm committing them to something I haven't asked about, but potentially they could come.
It may or may not be leading to a regulatory level, but I think just this whole slew of these emerging compounds, and it's going to keep coming up over and over and over again. What do? We have a compound where we don't have a good base. So I think it's just be helpful to understand what are our options and what are there. I think it may not be getting to a regulatory level, but I think we're on the cusp and have been. I mean, there's way more unregulated compounds and compounds that don't have sufficient talk, and we're just going to keep bumping into that. And so what do we? Well, at least to understand what's out there for now.
I think that's a good idea, and I think that as we move through the rest of these consent order compounds, we'll be running into the same issue. And so if we understand what is useful for CompTox, then it can help us either inform what we're doing or inform the application of the hazard index or something similar.
And make it more efficient for the other ones that we're going to bang into.
Dr. Tilson, I have another suggestion for Franny and the rest of us. There are a few states that are in this leading pact, and it would be useful to see if they have addressed this in their own way, and whether there's any opportunity for learning off of that. So what we can do is reach out to them, and we're in communications with their tox folks as well as their policy folks. And we'll get back with them.
That'd be great. Great. Any other comments or discussions? All right. Then next on our agenda is whether or not we've had anybody else throughout, so we've had no public forum requests. Okay, terrific. And then I guess the last item is if there's any other, from the board, not specifically on this topic, but any other questions or recommendations or thoughts of what we might want to address in service of DEQ and DEHS that Dr. Asperger teed up before he left. Yes.
So I have a question, so Tom and I, we served on the predecessor to this board where we were looking at air toxics, using that in the broadest sense. And we were pretty busy. And it seems like in the last 3-4 years, with very, very, very few exceptions, we have not had any discussion about air quality standards. So is that outside of our purview, or is that just everything has been put to the back burner because of PFAS, people, pick whatever letters you want? Maybe an update on where we stand on that? We had a list of priority chemicals.
It was substantial.
Yeah.
When that board was dissolved. So there's a list of chemicals that we ought to look at for air quality issues.
And for compounds like, say, hydrogen sulfide, we work with the state to help develop numbers. And, it was basically chemicals that were not being looked at by EPA.
The only one we talked about is methyl bromide, really.
Yeah.
There was methyl bromide, there was a potent irritant, remember?
Yeah.
It was a terrible irritant that was used in some, making mattresses, inflating foam.
Right.
You bring a pretty good point, and I think in the next meeting, we can have the Division of Air Quality folks provide some response. My understanding is about maybe 4 or 5 years ago, there was a work product out of this board when you were in the Air Quality Division. That was a summarization of priority compounds for evaluation for the AALs. And that report is still the latest work product that contains your recommendations as to which compounds perhaps may need to be looked at, primarily because they are part of our emission sources, but also there may be updated science. But what we need is from the air quality management team to come back to us as to what their request may be and whether there needs to be any updating to those AALs based on new science. So Joelle's here, Joelle Burleson, and she'll help us get those answers.
Other thoughts or suggestions?
Well, I don't know, it might be out there, but I've just been involved, there's out west in California, Southern California particularly, in Seattle, tire wear inputs into aquatic systems has become a huge issue. And particularly things that are used in the vulcanization process like zinc and a thing called 6-PPO, whatever, which I can't remember what it is for, which are extremely toxic to aquatic organisms. So it would be, in there it's always related to stormwater runoff going into systems and then having like incredible effects, for example, on salmonids in the Puget Sound and area and so forth. So I don't know if that's, something crazy for North Carolina, but it's certainly, I would think in big urban areas like RDU and Charlotte, it would be of some concern. So they're doing a lot of monitoring for that. I don't know.
So the tire wear particle thing is something that I have been kind of keeping an ear to the ground on. It's 6-PPD quinone. And there's been this really interesting and informative study done in the Snohomish River in Washington State showing that the coho salmon are incredibly susceptible to that particular compound.
Although they don't know, what they'll point out is that It's just they found that because it causes immediately huge fish mortalities in coho salmon in this area. But no one has a clue if there's no reason to think that coho salmon are inherently sensitive. It's just they're the ones that are in this area that are high value, high visibility. So, and I'm, just putting it out there because when I was, going through this, I was kind of amazed at that and like, well, how
There are
wouldn't
only,
that be also of concern in urban areas in North Carolina?
yes, I've been thinking about that a lot.
There's right now a movement in California a serious movement in California to require that zinc is no longer used in tires. And zinc is one of the key vulcanization products that accounts for something like 3% of tires by weight. So I'm curious, what are they going to do? It's going to be, and if California does that, like with the flame retardant issue, it's likely to spread through the country.
Yeah, there's only 2 commercial labs or third-party labs right now that can analyze for 6-PPD. And I talked to that gentleman from Snohomish about his fish and getting some of our fish analyzed for that. And I honestly have just not gotten to it yet. But I am thinking about it a lot. And I served on a PFAS panel last year at the Georgia Environmental Conference immediately before the 6-PPD quinone panel. And so they were talking a lot about all of that and the tire wear particles. And I was just curious about the Cape Fear River as well, because it kind of takes all of our metropolitan areas and puts them in one nice little package for us. So I am really interested in that.
Cool.
And I want to move forward on it, but I just haven't gotten to it with the rest of it.
Yeah, that's the point. Rather than focus on the specific compounds too, I know there was a lot of data really on just tire wear products, because they don't, there's PAHs or all kind of stuff and tire erosion things. So it might be is useful starting out with just something broad like tire wear. I forget what the term is, tire wear products or something. I'm glad it's on your radar.
And what might be good is if we bring back, several years ago, we had prioritized lists of things we wanted to do, and then we could add the air and make sure that we've kind of gotten through those prioritized lists, and then think about what might be emerging compounds next to think about.
So was PFAS the last thing that we were scheduled to get to?
I think it was Gen X officially.
Well, Gen X.
Well, but then there was some other ones. There was hexavalent chromium, there was methylbromide. I think we've gotten through, I think we just want to go back and make sure that we've gotten through all them. Then we can add the air one and then think about what might be next.
I think that's a great idea. And Tom and I had talked about kind of revising or coming up with a new list at the beginning of this year. And I've also been meaning to have an individual phone call with all of you about things like that. So I'll do that before the next meeting, I promise.
We can do that, and between DEQ and DHS, we collaborate a lot too. We can put through between what might we want to also bring up as potential ones to prioritize. So we could do that. Terrific. Other comments? All right, anything else from DEQ or DHHS? All right, I want to, so grateful for you all continuing service and the brilliance and the scientific as well as the pragmatic and policy lens that you bring to this discussion. Again, I think North Carolina is just in such better position, I think, in many states because of all this infrastructure. So thank you for that, and thank you, my DHS colleagues and my DEQ colleagues, for all of the work. It's hard from a science standpoint, it's hard from a risk communication, it's hard from a regulatory standpoint, and so thank you for all that. And I will take credit for ending the meeting 8 minutes early, so you can tell Tom that he owes me 8 minutes, but thank you all very, very much. And so I think in June, we have the building up of a really nice agenda for June, so I'm very grateful.
We need a motion to adjourn.
Oh, I do.
We might take 8 minutes of discussion and then.
No, we will not. I solicit a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second.
All right, all in favor?
Aye.
All right, we are officially adjourned. Thank you all.